things, haha. I would like to echo I would like to echo what my colleague from the third party just said, though, and part of it is people have to actually know about that this exists. And so if I could, I would like to suggest that the government take some of the money from the advertising that they're doing on jobs here, which is, doesn't provide information, and take money from that and do some of it, use some of it to let people know that if you, once this bill passes, if you are a victim of domestic violence and you need to get out of your lease so that you can move on in your life, you can do that. Here's the procedure, because that's the other thing. I was doing a radio interview the other day and they asked me about it, and they said, well, do you just sort of tell your landlord you've been the victim of domestic abuse? And in fact, no, there is a procedure to follow. And so having an informed populace is important, and people who are in domestic violence, situations of domestic violence, chiefly women, need to know what the procedure is, so that if it happens to them, they will know what to do. And with those few remarks, I'd like to take my seat. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I, too, am going to make some comments on this bill. I think it's a very positive bill that the minister's brought forward. I know that the NDP is not used to me standing up saying they're doing something positive, but this is something positive. And, in this case, it is something very positive, and as my honourable colleague has indicated, I think it's important that there's a mechanism to inform individuals that are caught under this unfortunate situation where they may be in domestic violence. And possibly the minister may look at the preparation of a standard lease, and the lease may actually, could have the leases say that in the leases when people sign them. You don't have to completely describe it, but how to contact the department to find out what they have to do. Because in most of these cases I've witnessed and seen that the people are very traumatized, and indeed to have to go forward through a bunch of red tape, and it sounds like a bunch of red tape that people have to go through. Not that it's not justified, don't get me wrong. I think it's very justified, the red tape. But I think we want to make it as easy as possible for individuals in that situation to access the possibility of terminating their lease and alleviating the financial strain that they may have. So with those few words, I would like to thank the minister for bringing this important bill forward. He's brought some other amendments to the Residential Tenancy Act, and most of those have been quite good. And he's made some more adjustments which have corrected some of the other problems that were created, both in the past and by the new bills that he had put in place. So I think it's been very, very positive, the approach we've taken on this, and we're slowly getting to a situation that both satisfies the needs of landlords and the needs of tenants. And I think that's a balance that is very difficult to achieve. And indeed, we're closer to that than we have been. And I look forward to the minister moving this forward to law amendments and see what kind of response we have there.
Recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will too reiterate the comments of my colleagues. I think this is a good step that the government is making. Obviously, it's responding with the domestic violence courts that we now have in place. What we have to realize, Madam Speaker, in these situations, they're very traumatic for the individual who is at risk of being having domestic violence brought against them, or who has experienced it. It's a detrimental situation for children that are involved, and oftentimes we forget that a lot of domestic violence situations go unreported, and they go unreported simply because the individual who is at risk or who has experienced domestic violence doesn't know their options, don't have the opportunity or the knowledge, as some of my colleagues had made mention, of avenues that will help them get out of these drastic situations. Over the last number of years, I want to speak to landlords who have worked with our office on particular cases. And keep in mind that a lot of times when a victim is experiencing violence, there's very little window of opportunity to get them out of that situation. So it's about coordinating services and rallying around the individual and the family and the children with a holistic approach. And having this one piece in place, and the minister spoke to the financial implications of it. It's more than the financial piece. That plays a major role, obviously. But I want to make a comment in regards to, a number of landlords who, over the years, understand the ramifications of somebody who has experienced domestic violence, and they've subsequently, looked at trying to remedy the situation and work with that individual. And especially in my community, Madam Speaker, they realize that this is not right when this happens to people. This is not right to the children that are involved. And they have an opportunity to step up and help alleviate this situation. And of course, justifiably, they don't want it spilling over to the rest of their tenants, because when somebody is a victim of domestic violence, everybody around them hears this, especially in the multi-unit dwellings. So I think this is a good opportunity. The awareness piece was mentioned by my colleague from Inverness. And again, when you're a victim, oftentimes you don't know what steps are there for you to take, what avenues are there for you to take, and you're often scared. That's why a lot of it goes unreported. But I think if there's an awareness campaign, of course, victims, the Director of Victim Services, people like Bryony House, who run the shelter for women and children who experience violence. Once these folks get a handle on this piece of legislation, I think we're going to benefit from it. If I was to make mention of one possible future piece of legislation the minister could bring in, one of the things I've experienced over the last number of years is families that have had a separation. There's, a husband and wife or partners are on a lease together, and there is a legal separation that's taken place. Oftentimes, landlords will hold that person that chose to leave that home or that rental unit accountable. And that's been a real issue. And for an MLA to go in that situation and try to coerce and navigate, negotiate with the landlord has been a lot more difficult. So if there's a legal separation in the partnership, I think in future we should possibly look at adding that in as a piece of legislation. When it comes to the domestic violence piece, Mr. Speaker, I've had absolutely full involvement and full appreciation from every landlord that I've had to deal with in regards to these situations. Because again, they understand that it's more than the dollar that they're going to collect from that family. It's more than the dollar that's coming out of that pocket of that individual that is experiencing it. It's their children. It's the whole situation moving forward. So I've had success without this piece. But I think this is a good step to actually put it in the law. But if you could take in consideration that other piece, because landlords are less apt to want to negotiate that piece, I'd appreciate it. With those few words, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, with this bill coming before us today, I wasn't going to say anything on it at first. I think that the current critic for women, for the status of women in the Liberal Party, said it very well, as have the other members on this House that have gotten up to speak on the bill. But I think what's important is that very seldom do we get the opportunity to talk about domestic violence in the legislature. And it's a subject that I know affects all of us in our ridings. In discussions previously, and here in the House, the leader of the Liberal Party has said that of all the issues he's dealt with as an MLA, and he was elected in 2003, as were quite a number of us here in the House, in all those 9 years, he said the most difficult issue has been domestic violence. When he's had people in his office, people that he was trying to advocate for, and for him to see face to face, to come face to face with what it means to a family and to a woman, to what's happening in their lives, the fear and the uncertainty, and in fact, it can be and is in fact often a life and death decision to leave. And so being able to leave an apartment lease and to be able to seek some safety and not have the financial concern as well that your credit rating is going to be ruined and that you're running out on a lease or that you're not doing what you're obliged to do, is something that it is only right that we take care of here today and move this bill forward, see that it become law, because I think all of us can appreciate we've had some experience with that. And as members of the House know, I had advocated for the domestic violence strategy that the government has subsequently put in place. We do have that strategy today. It was a bill that I had called for when the Conservatives were still in government. It had reached third reading, in fact. It went through second reading with good accolades on all sides of the House that we needed to have this strategy. It had speakers at law amendments in support of it. And then because of very petty reasons on the part of the then Justice Minister, it did not reach third reading here in the House. It was pulled. And I think it's worth remembering that an issue as important as domestic violence, and I know there are members, men and women in the House who remember that, it was an affront to the issue that was at hand. It related to my not voting the way I was expected to vote in a vote at law amendments, that I voted based on each issue being separate, and I did not vote in the way that the minister wanted on one issue, so he refused to call that bill here for third reading to become law where we were all in favor of it. And I think it is really a travesty that that's sometimes the way this House works. I don't accept it, and I would hope that that wouldn't happen now with the current minister. I can't say for sure it wouldn't, because sometimes partisan issues become paramount in this House. But the issue of domestic violence is an area where I think we can find common ground as members from whatever political persuasion we hold. This is an issue that I feel we need to talk about more at the House, that we need to see action in big and little ways, and this is one of those pieces that we can do that helps. It's not the major thing that's going to change society's acceptance or how we regard domestic violence. It's not going to make all the difference in the world, but it's going to help people when they are in crisis. It's going to be able to be one tool that will help people in crisis. And I just feel too often that the days go by and we read in the paper often, like frequently, about women that have been injured, sometimes killed as a result of domestic violence. It happens every year in this country, in this province, that we have women murdered, and it's based on intimate partner relationships. And I think that it's an issue that if we don't raise it occasionally and speak here on the floor of the House, we might just feel that there's nothing we can do about it or we're not addressing it. I know we have a strategy in place. I mentioned that it had a difficult start. The bill did not pass in the House. In response to the public's demand for something to be done, in the face of us getting expectations raised by going as far as law amendments, the minister of the time, the Justice Minister at that time, the Conservative Justice Minister, decided he would have his own committee, that he would strike it as a minister, that the committee would report to the minister, not to the House of Assembly. My bill had called for the House of Assembly to be the place for an annual update on what we were doing as a province, what steps we've taken, how the stats might be improving, hopefully. I was looking that we would actually get a handle on what the numbers are and how they might be improving over time. So this bill, Mr. Speaker, is very important in moving forward on those things. I expect this year, when we have our update on the domestic violence strategy, I'm expecting that it will come on December 6th when we meet, to commemorate really a day of action against violence against women, a day that we think of the victims of domestic violence and we talk about what can be done, what has been done. And I'm looking forward to hearing the minister's report at that time, the minister on the status of women's report, on how we're doing and what has been advanced. And I would hope that this will be one of the successes for the year, that this also is included. I know a program has begun to talk about I think it's a campaign to get people to speak if you're a neighbor or a friend or have any contact with a woman that you know is being abused, to try and intervene and to give people the tools that they can have to speak up, to talk to the woman, and maybe to help offer some substantial guidance, because many people don't say anything because they don't know what to say. And we, as a society, we have been too accepting of the fact that there is domestic violence in every community. And it doesn't matter, Mr. Speaker, if it's a wealthy community, doesn't matter if it's a well-educated community. It happens in homes of all socioeconomic levels. It may be that we're more aware of it where people have less money or less resources because they are the people who have nowhere to turn but our shelters or nowhere to turn but the social safety net. But it exists in every community, and it's important that as a group we all, as members of the legislature, speak against this and condemn it, and remember to do whatever we can to pass bills that might improve the situation for women and their children when they're trying to escape this kind of situation. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, this bill will fill one part of that moving forward and that improvement to the system that we have in place. But also the call on the domestic violence strategy was to look at what other jurisdictions are doing and to try and find some best practices. And I'm sure that there are other jurisdictions that are doing more in this regard. I'm not the expert on it, neither am I the critic at the moment for this area, Mr. Speaker, but I know that there is a very a strong component of people working in the Status of Women office, and I'm hoping that they are working diligently as well to research and explore what other things we can be doing here in this province, because this is an issue that should matter greatly to all of us as members of the legislature, and I'm looking forward to hearing anybody who comes in support of this bill at law amendments and to hear from other members as well as it goes through the legislative process. I hope to see this law by the end of this session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise this afternoon to speak a second reading of this very important amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act. As members know, the Residential Tenancies Act was overhauled, I guess, for the want of a better word, modernized just recently, and this amendment took a little bit longer to come forward. I want to thank the Minister for Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations for bringing this legislation forward in this session, because I know that there's been an awful lot of hard work that's been done by a number of people across government. When I was with the Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations and we were looking at the Residential Tenancies Act, this is one component that I felt was very, very important to add. And unfortunately, due to the legal aspects of the amendment that would have been needed, and to make sure we did it right, this was in the hands of the committee, and I want to thank the committee for working diligently on this, and also the people at the Justice Department that were working on this to make sure that when we put it in place, it was done correctly and laid out very clearly within the Residential Tenancies Act. So this was something that was brought forward when we first became government, and I commend the members opposite for their diligence in bringing it forward too. And it's always difficult, as you know, as members know, with legislation. Sometimes small pieces, what it sounds like it can be simple, is actually extremely complicated to make sure that we do it right. And so I, again, want to thank the Justice Department for working on making sure we had the proper language, that we had the proper measures in place to protect people who are living in abusive situations. When people live in abusive situations, they have many worries, and financial worries are paramount. If you're in a situation with young children and trying to leave and worrying about the bills and how to move forward. And on that note, I just want to also thank all of the people across Nova Scotia that do take care of people who have left because of domestic violence. I know that in my own area, Chrysalis House does phenomenal work and supports women in our community that have had to leave because of abuse. And sometimes it's very difficult for people to know what happens behind closed doors in a community, in any house. Domestic abuse crosses many socioeconomic lines, and also it's embarrassing, it's stigmatizing, so sometimes people that are living in abusive situations don't speak up. This is one piece in an overall way of we're looking at, as this government is looking at ways that we can support people who are living in abusive situations to leave and to be supported. This is just one piece of work that we've done. We've created a comprehensive strategic domestic violence action plan, which was launched in December of 2010. We launched a toll-free domestic violence information telephone line on October of this year. We've expanded the Restorative Approaches program in schools, which helps young people learn to properly manage relationships in conflict. And this way of dealing with conflict and teaching our young people how to resolve conflict, we hope we'll see the end of domestic violence, because we're hoping that we were able to teach our young people, if you have a problem, how we can speak up, how we can resolve that together in a restorative manner. Also, we've opened a domestic violence court in Sydney to support families that are affected by domestic violence in June of this year. This is a very complicated subject. It is fraught with many difficulties, but we are moving forward in every possible way we can to support people who are in abusive situations. And I have to say that the Residential Tenancies Act, having this amendment, is just one piece to support people who are living with domestic violence, so that they know that when they leave, that they are not going to be encumbered by a lease that they will either hamper their ability to have a good credit rating. And on that piece, I know that many people who are in relationships and when they leave do not have a credit rating, and to make sure that people look at that very important component to build your credit rating. And this is one area that when you leave, that it will not be held against you. So I want to thank the Minister for bringing this forward. I want to commend all members of the House for supporting this amendment and supporting anybody that lives with any kind of abuse or violence in their life, so that we can support them and also at the same time find ways to mitigate this scourge that we're dealing with. So with those few words, again, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased and saddened, actually, also to have to rise in my place today to talk about Bill number 50, which is 150, sorry, the Residential Tenancies Act. I'm pleased because we are making changes to it that will help the lives of people suffering from domestic violence issues, but I'm still very saddened that this is such a huge problem in our society today. And it's interesting that the minister previously had mentioned a scourge on our society, because that is exactly the words that I'd written down. I find that domestic violence is a scourge in North America, in Nova Scotia, in our Western civilization, and I find that in the 21st century, I find it very hard to believe that this is still going on, and unfortunately, although it's not necessarily an accepted practice, something is going on that is making people still act in this fashion and feel that they can actually do it and get away with it, and perhaps get so taken up with their own emotions that that their own emotions are more important than the life or the feelings or the wishes and desires of another. Perhaps it's the power over syndrome, which is also part of domestic violence. Oftentimes it's a power play that goes on, and unfortunately it is very, very a sad situation. So knowing quite a bit about domestic violence from my own life and from also people that I know, I believe that this Residential Tenancies Act amendment will be very, very helpful, because when people, not just women, mainly women, but there's also men as well that suffer from this, when they have to face the facts that they need to leave their nest, their home that they've built with their families, with their supposed loved one, the one that they thought that they could trust, that they could count on when they first got together with that person and built a life, when they first start to realize that there's a problem and that they need an escape, It's overwhelming, Mr. Speaker. And many people, especially if they're in a financial situation where they're relying on another for their finances, there are just so many details to think about how are you going to leave, how are you going to take care of your children, your business, your life, that people put it off. They put it off and they put it off. They don't do anything. They stick around. They think, oh, well, maybe it'll get better. Maybe they'll change. Maybe it's just my imagination, because a lot of the times what happens is a thing called crazy making, where the person who is actually violent makes the person who's the victim feel that it's all them and it's their fault and that it's all in their head. And after somebody's been in a situation for a long time, they start to believe it. They start to believe it's their fault. They start to believe that they feel guilty. And I've heard it said that it's very much like putting a frog in a pot of boiling water, well, a pot of water on the stove. Because when people say, well, now, you're a smart woman, what are you doing in domestic violence? How come you're an abused woman or whatever? And if you look at it this way, they say it's like putting a frog in some water in a pot on the stove. At first, it's just room temperature. So the frog stays in the pot quite happily in the water. But if you start to turn the heat up a tiny little bit at a time, just a little bit, so that the frog is starting to feel comfortable, it's warm, doesn't really notice it, bit by bit by bit, until finally it is boiling, boiling, boiling hot, the frog will actually die in the pot. It won't get out. This is how an analogy that has been used, I've heard, in different group sessions as to why people stay in abusive relationships, because they don't notice it happening at first, and finally they're almost brainwashed into staying in the relationship. I've talked to many women and men who don't even know when they're being abused. They feel uncomfortable, they're not happy, they're actually quite miserable in the relationship, but they don't really know until you talk to them what abuse is. So for instance, if somebody is yelling at, snapping at, screaming at, calling names, this is abuse. This is verbal abuse, there is psychological abuse, and I would like to say that psychological and verbal abuse is just as bad as physical abuse, and in some cases worse, because again, the person doesn't really realize that it's abuse. I've heard some women say, if he only hit me, I could leave. If he only did this, then I'd know, oh, I can't put up with this anymore, I'm gonna leave. But if it's all mental and verbal and psychological, then they tend to try and stick it out for the kids, or they think things are going to get better. And it's a very sad situation, Mr. Speaker, and so that's why I think that Bill 150 is good, because it takes away one little piece of the puzzle of how people are going to deal with it if they are going to leave and get out while they can. And I would like to say that in a society and in a province where we still have a young woman being found floating down the Myra River in Cape Breton in a gym bag, where we have another young woman found in the trunk of a car in the school where she is a teacher, where we have another young woman found stuffed in the walls of her apartment where she lived with her husband, or 4 women found drowned in a car in the Rideau Canal in Ottawa, supposedly by accident, then we have a serious problem. And one of the things this government did when we first came into office was to talk to our Justice Minister, to talk to the various ministers and say, what are we going to do about domestic violence? And I would say that this bill came out of that. And I want to thank the MLA for King South for starting it. I want to thank the Minister of Service Nova Scotia for continuing it and making this become a reality. I'd also like to mention that people are doing things to try and bring attention to this around the province. And one thing that I'm doing personally is Joy Laking is a wonderful artist, a visual artist in Great Village. And she has actually written a play, her first play. It's called Invisible Prisons. And it's about domestic violence. Because she said when you're in a situation of domestic violence, it's like you're in an invisible prison. You don't even know you're in it, but you've got to get out, but you don't know how. And she's written this play, and it is 14 different monologues that she's gathered from different women who've suffered from domestic violence issues, and 2 men. who were also victims of domestic violence. So I like the fact that the men are not the perpetrators, they are also victims too. And I think that there are a lot of men who are in situations where they're ashamed or afraid to come out and speak about it as well. So it is a societal problem. And so I'm going to be producing this play as the MLA in Truro Bible Hill for International Women's Day next year, March the 8th at the Marigold Theatre in Truro. Yeah, and who knows? Maybe you can come, or maybe it will come to a theater near you very shortly afterwards. But we're also going to take it to Nova Women's Prison. We've asked for permission, and we've been given it. So we're going to make it free for students. So anybody with a student card. We will have a captive audience, yes, indeed. But I think they will very much appreciate it, especially because when you really think about it, many of the women who are at the prison, why are they there? Many of them are because they've suffered from abuse and violence. And so I think, you know, we are going to take invisible prisons inside the prison for them to be able to relate to and enjoy. And the more we talk about it, I agree with my compatriot over there, all of us. It's nice to see us all in violent agreement for once. And wonderful to see the House together on this. So again, with those few words, I will take my place, and I'm really, really pleased to see this bill number 150 come forward. Thank you.
If I am to recognize the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, it'll be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all the people, members who had comments on this piece of legislation. I appreciate the good words, and I actually appreciate their efforts in trying to bring recognition of this issue to the House. And I think the question around making sure that that victims know that there is a process and what that entails. The Department of Justice, certainly through their victim services, encounter this issue every day, and counsel victims on what is available to help them. So I want to assure members that there's, no point in bringing about an amendment like this without doing the follow-up to ensure that the people who need the service can get the service. And I don't want members to think that although there is a process around this, actually the Department of Justice, the Victim Services, will actually give a certificate. They'll do the investigation. They'll give a certificate to the victim, and they can take that to their landlord. There will be no discussion by the landlord on this. In other words, when they show up with that certificate, that is the end of the story, and it doesn't entail, long, contracted discussions about the events. It's very clean and for the benefit of the victim, that they don't have to engage in explanations to their landlords, which we think would be helpful for them at a very delicate, serious time for them and for their families. With those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 150.
Question is for second reading of Bill 150, the Residential Tenancy Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour? Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 150, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
Order that Bill 150, the Residential Tenancy Act, be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call public bills for third reading.
Public bills for third reading.
Please call bill number 111, the Fur Industry Act.
Bill number 111, the Fur Industry Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't speak at length on this act. I think members would be aware of the introduction of this act. I think spring 2010, and would know that the issue facing the fur industry and communities, particularly in the southwest region of the province. So this act was really written and designed to ensure that the industry had a template for environmental protection, really, so that we wouldn't have an industry that was polluting the environment. And I think the most recent amendments to that act really were around the applying an administrator for any issues of engagement between the sector and the Department of Agriculture, so that wasn't entirely left to the minister for their engagement. And members would also, I think, hope that the appropriate legislation or appropriate regulation would be in place for this piece of legislation. And I want them to rest assured that this is the case. Regulation to complement this piece of legislation has been a long time in the making. I think when my staff first indicated to me around the process around getting the regulations written for this legislation, they indicated that we would be 3 years getting regulations done, and I told them they had 1. And it's taken us 2. Mr. Speaker, I have to take my hat off to the people at the Department of Agriculture who worked on this. They have done yeoman service. They consulted broadly. Matter of fact, even when we thought we were at a place where we had pretty well had the regulations written, we went back actually and revisited some issues raised by other communities and incorporated what we heard from them, to tighten up the regulations. I don't know if I want to make the presumption that they're perfect. I think this is new territory. I think it's probably new territory for any government in the country. Members may not be aware, but when it comes to guidelines around manure storage and the water running off a farm in this province, and I think generally across the country, that the conditions around that are really guidelines. The instruction of that is really guidelines. But now for this industry, it will be in statute what they can do around how they have to dispose of manure from their farms and waste feed and carcasses. I think that is certainly unique for this industry, and I think unique for agriculture. And members may not be aware that half of Canada's mink production is in Nova Scotia. And purely the genesis of that back in the 1930s was really the fishing industry. In southwest Nova, there was a lot of fish byproduct from a fishing industry, and that really allowed a few individuals, to start keeping some mink and had a cheap source of food, and that industry has just grown incredibly. I think last year somewhere in the range of 1,300,000, 400,000 mink pelts came out of Nova Scotia, and as far as farm gate sales, the dairy industry in Nova Scotia was the big winner for years and years. 100 million, I think maybe last year might have been 120 million, but the mink industry was 140 million last year. So it's a big enough industry that it surpassed the dairy industry. So I have to also give credit to mink producers who were involved in this process. They were very good to work with, considering that we're regulating their industry, but they definitely were concerned about the impacts of their industry on the environment and in their communities, and so they were helpful, I think, in trying to encourage government along and to consult with and as we sought information. Anyway, every mink farm, I think it's above 100 animals, will need an engineered plan to ensure that the waste on that farm does not wind up in the environment, creating some negative impact. And we really actually appreciate what those new dollars into the economy in Nova Scotia, what that means, but certainly a lot of the individuals in this industry are younger farmers, which is something we don't see everywhere, so we're glad for that. And also it's helping to sustain rural Nova Scotia and the economy in rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. With those few comments, I move third reading of Bill 111, the Fur Industry Act.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and please rise to my place today and speak to this bill. And it is indeed one that's quite specific around a couple of additions to the Fur Act, and those have been accepted and supported by the fur industry, and feel that those are also good measures to include. But I really just wanted to say today that when the four representatives of the industry came to law amendments, they weren't really too concerned about this piece of legislation, but rather they were concerned that the regulations that are going to actually support the legislation and direct the future of the industry, that they have not been brought forward. And whether it was Simeon Roberts or Matt Moses, Dan Mullen, Henry Vissers from the Federation, they all really were on the same issue, and were certainly in accord around the fact that they want to see these regulations. As the minister rightfully pointed out, it's an industry that has done very, very well, but it's moving forward is challenged by the fact that many of those who want to invest in the industry don't have all the very specific and detailed guidelines on how they will expand or build new, and we know that the environmental issues and all of the four again, strong support to the industry. They want to know what the environmental requirements will be for the industry, and they know that they're going to have to invest quite heavily to safeguard their industry, and they do want to be good stewards in the areas in which they live. And in fact, the farmers themselves talked about having best practices so that their neighbors were not in any way whatsoever negatively impacted by their business and their way of making a living through the raising of mink. So I think that was the message that came forward. There was a little bit of I guess concern around what the very specific role of the administrator will be in carrying out his duties, and in fact whether it'll be one person or whether it will be an actual board or an office that would actually now look at the industry because of the way it has expanded and the way it needs to be regulated. So, Mr. Speaker, it is indeed all about the regulations, I think, from this point forward, and hopefully very, very soon we will see those regulations. Many, interestingly enough, and perhaps the minister did address some of those points as well, but many are already probably in full compliance with the kind of regulations that will actually be brought forward, because the mink industry here, supported by research at the Agriculture College in Truro, have already been doing, I guess, leading work when it comes to raising mink, and have created a very sustainable, very viable industry. It has been in the past subject to, of course, some of the swings of the marketplace, but I think they're taking a look at a very important industry and having it not grow to the extremes where they will impact themselves, but rather they will be monitoring what's happening in a global industry. And when we say a global industry here, the real good thing about the industry, Mr. Speaker, is that it indeed is all new money that comes into the province, and there are hundreds of jobs related to this industry, whether it's in the feed kitchens, whether it's working with the pelts, and it's the shipping off to the big central auction houses. So it is indeed an industry that I've been prepared to showcase. And in fact, just a summer ago, when we had a delegation of 35 Americans come here to Nova Scotia as part of CSG, and leading an agriculture field trip to the Valley, I was certainly pleased to take them to a state-of-the-art mink ranch near Berwick to see for themselves that it is being done very, very well, and I think it bodes well for the people who are showing leadership in this industry. And I think all of us that were in law amendments when these 4 people were there, are absolutely seeing firsthand that they want the regulations, and they are more than prepared to live with these and make them part of their industry going forward. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm only going to take a moment. I'm not going to beleaguer this, especially here in third reading, but just to stand up and once again state what's already been stated, I guess, so that we do support this, and that we know the industry is looking forward and looking forward to how things play out by way of regulations, and hopefully they'll have a detailed part in how all this is done. And I think the minister certainly said that he's open to that, and at least from what I hear from the other side, from those who are in the industry, who want this to continue to be as successful as it has been in past years and continue to grow the way that it should, because as we all know, when it comes to agricultural opportunities in this province, we really, really need to make sure that this works and works well. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat.
If I am to recognize a minute, it will be to close debate. The Minister of Service Nova Scotia and the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to assure members opposite, certainly around the question that was raised around regulations. We couldn't bring the regulations to cabinet without the bill being in place to allow for the regulation. And as much as that has taken longer than I ever dreamed, but with that said, Mr. Speaker, when the bill makes it through the House, the regs are pretty much ready to go, and it'll be my hope that they'll get to cabinet. I'd like to say before Christmas, so the industry won't have to wait long. And actually, the member from Kings West indicated that certainly there are producers who would be in compliance or very close to compliance with the regs, and we didn't want them, engaging in expanding their operations. They have 3 years to comply with the regs, and so to spend money and then have to re-spend it, we didn't think was wise. So we tried to have a fairly continuous dialogue with them about what they should expect, so that if they were going to be spending money, that they wouldn't have to do that twice. Anyway, I thank members opposite for their comments. I think this is a really good piece of legislation, and the regs will be helpful for everyone concerned. With that, I move third reading of Bill 111, Mr. Speaker.
The question is for third reading of Bill 111, the Fur Industry Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour? Aye. Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 111, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 2010, the Fur Industry Act.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call Bill number 131, the School Board Members' Duties Clarification Act.
Bill number 131. The School Board Members' Duty Clarification Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 131 be read a third time. I wish to thank those that took time to speak to this bill at Law Amendments Committee. And as I've said previously, Mr. Speaker, I believe school board members are working hard to support our students. And these amendments to the Education Act are another step to help them be as effective as they can be in setting a vision and priority for the good of all students in their regions. Last weekend, the Cape Breton Post asked the chairs of both the Strait Regional School Board and the Cape Breton Victoria Regional School Board about this legislation. And I'd like to share their remarks with the House, Mr. Speaker. Mary Jess MacDonald, chair of the Strait Board, said, "It's very positive to clarify roles when you're collaborating with other people, and it's very useful to know the roles and board members to know the roles that board members are expected to fill." And Lord Green, the chair of the Cape Breton Board, said that, "I think this is a clear, defined role for board members and will put us on the right track." And I'll table these remarks, Mr. Speaker. And once again, I think they show that our boards consider this a very positive step. Mr. Speaker, some of the members opposite have suggested that this legislation is redundant because Section 64 of the Education Act describes the duties of a school board. Well, it does indeed, Mr. Speaker, but Section 64 did not make a clear distinction between the elected board and the operational staff. It was certainly open to misinterpretation. And unfortunately, we do know that there have been a few cases where board members did misinterpret those clauses. If the Education Act leaves any chance for confusion, Mr. Speaker, any chance at all, we need to make sure that we take the opportunity to make things clear. And that is exactly what we've done with this amendment. There is one other point I'd like to make, Mr. Speaker. I did understand it came up at Law Amendments, and I've seen it repeated in the media, that this legislation somehow has changed the relationship between the elected board and the superintendent. That is clearly not the case. Section 39 of the Education Act says that the superintendent is accountable to the school board, and Section 42 says a school board is accountable to the electorate. This amendment doesn't change that relationship in any way. What it does, it makes it clearer. As I've mentioned, many school board members have said this is a very positive step, and superintendents have expressed that as well. It is in the best interest of our school boards, our parents, and, Mr. Speaker, most importantly, to our students, that we do everything we can to put students' success first. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat, and I look forward to seeing Bill 131 receive the support of this House. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today and make a few comments regarding Bill 131. I certainly did speak to this bill when it was first before the House, and I listened and read with interest the press release from the minister when she made the announcement, and I also listened with interest to the comments that were made at that time. Subsequent to that, I have read the presentations that went before law amendments, and it certainly suggests to all of those people who have spoken to this and about this that the focus of the legislation should be on students, and to suggest that school board members do not have students as their priority I think is, as I've said, disrespectful to those school board members. There are people in this House who have served as school board members, and they let their names stand to sit on a school board because they wanted to have students as a priority. They wanted students to be, to their focus to be in the best interest of students. So when you listen to the comments made by the minister at the press conference and in her press release, it simply repeats that. And, you know, the government did do a little bit of a trip around the province to talk about to people who were interested in serving on school boards. And then following that, this legislation came in, and people are wondering, well, what is different now than what we heard in our orientation session or our information session? So when you put the litmus test to any bill that comes from the Department of Education and comes before us, that litmus test should be, how does this make things better for the kids in our classroom? And when you apply that, then you know that if that is proving that this will make a positive difference, then you know that you've shown leadership and that you know you have acted in their best interest. This bill does not pass that litmus test. It's redundant in that many of the things that it speaks to are already included in the Act, and many of the things that are referred to are responsibilities that board members have. Otherwise, they would never be interested in serving on a school board. So it's the same with other bills from education in the last couple of years. There is really no substance to them. I would welcome an opportunity to debate a bill that does make a difference for kids. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise here to say a few words this afternoon. I'll be brief, but I did sit in on the Law Amendments Committee as well. And from the people we heard from Law Amendments, this bill is not going to do anything to help the kids actually in the classroom. It's taking away the voice of some of the elected officials and transferring it to the superintendent so that the superintendent has the final say, and the elected officials cannot equally represent the family, the taxpayers, or the communities. And from what I can see, that this bill is already enacted in legislation as it is in the Education Act, and it's disappointing to see that this is being debated, that the money is not being spent on actually people in the classroom. So with those few words, I'll take my seat.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to rise and speak briefly on third reading of Bill 131, an act respecting the clarification of school board members' duties.
And get him to put a hole in it.
As many of my colleagues may be aware, in 2011 there were issues in my region related to the operation of the South Shore District School Board, and an independent inquiry was conducted which ultimately led to the dismissal of the board and its replacement with a one-person overseer, Miss Judithan Sullivan-Corney. Mr. Speaker, I believed then, as I believe now, that the intentions of the board members were admirable. But, however, At least part of the problem, I think, involved the fact that members were not completely aware of their duties and responsibilities. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the independent investigation confirmed that there were a number of board members who were unsure of their exact roles. For example, in some cases, board members saw their roles as being similar to those of a municipal councillor or an MLA. And what I mean by that is that they felt that they were representing sort of constituents in a district as opposed to being a member of a group that was mandated to oversee in a holistic way the educational issues in the district, and that they should be looking perhaps at participating in decisions affecting the entire board, and not a perspective really that involved parochial decisions affecting just their specific district. Mr. Speaker, I am of the opinion that these issues arose at least in part because of a lack of direction to board members in the Education Act itself. And this was pointed out to me, well, about a year ago by a good friend and constituent of mine, Mr. Brock Junkin, who suggested to me that I investigate the possibility of having the Act amended to provide more clarity in this regard. Mr. Speaker, I did exactly that. I passed the information on to the Minister of Education, whom I am pleased to say, very pleased to say, agreed with me and acted quickly to bring forth the amendments we see today. I believe these amendments will add clarity to the issues surrounding the duties and responsibility of school board members. And I thank the Minister for acting so quickly to address this issue. At this point in time, Mr. Speaker, a new board's been elected and a new chairperson is in place. And I would like to congratulate all the newly elected members of the South Shore District School Board. And I further hope these amendments will help them perform their duties with a greater sense of clarity and purpose. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important issue. And with those words, I will take my place.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise for just a couple of moments to speak in support of Bill number 131, the School Board Members' Duties Clarification Act. And I want to speak in support of it because I was struck when I listened to members of the opposition initially speak to this bill and describe it as something without substance and describe it as something that might be disrespectful to current or past school board members. In fact, I would like to say, Mr. Speaker, that having a chance to work with members of the school board in my area, both recently and in the past, I have a great deal of respect for those people who step forward and are interested in serving members of students and parents and families in that way. And I have every reason to think that those people who do step forward do so with the best of intentions. And I've had certainly the wonderful experience over the last 3.5 years to work with school board members on some significant projects in my area. And particularly, I've had an opportunity, I would like to mention the late Jenny White, who I think maybe exemplifies some of the virtues of an effective school board member who understand the roles of administration and understand the roles of governance. But my main reason, Mr. Speaker, for wishing to stand today to speak to Bill 131 is just to make a comment about the value of the bill as it relates to governance and administration. I've had the occasion in my life, probably because of my social work background, to work on a significant number of nonprofit boards. I've, as an administrator, worked for boards of directors. And I've had occasion to organize training sessions for board members. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that there is a difference between governance and administration. And it's really essential that those people who serve on boards understand the difference if they're to accomplish the most successful outcomes. And I think that Bill 131, Mr. Speaker, addresses that. There's a particular trap, I think, for members of boards. One trap is that they can become rubber stamps or simply parrots of administrators who do all the work. Or there's the converse difficulty that board members often fall into of meddling in the day-to-day management or administration of an organization. Both of those activities, I think, are pitfalls for boards, and they're common pitfalls. They're not isolated pitfalls. They're something that happen quite regularly. So while, Mr. Speaker, the point that I wanted to make, and I'll sum up with this, is that Bill 131 helps clarify that the roles of members of boards of school boards are different from roles of administrators. They set the stage from which that kind of orientation can be done, and I would like to congratulate the minister on having brought this bill forward, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to comment in this way in support of it.
If I am to recognize the Honourable Minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I move to close debate on Bill 131.
The question is for third reading on Bill number 131, the School Board Members' Duties Clarification Act. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favour? Aye. Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 131, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act, respecting the clarification of school board members' duties.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I will now recognize the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please call Bill number 133, the Intercity Bus Service Act.
Bill number 133, the Intercity Bus Service Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move third reading of Bill 133, the Intercity Bus Services Act. Given the comments of my friends across the way, I won't take very long in speaking on this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to introduce Bill 133, the Intercity Bus Service Act, on November the 16th. Mike Cassidy, President of Maritime Bus, and representatives from the Canadian Federation of Students and Students Nova Scotia and the Department of Seniors were kind enough to join me to show their support for this bill. Members will remember that those persons attended here and were in the gallery when the bill was introduced. The Intercity Bus Service Act will help to support reliable bus services here in our province. This act responds to concerns we've heard from many bus travelers and from the operators. Nova Scotians want to know they can depend on a reliable bus service, and bus operators want to be successful. Mr. Speaker, this act strikes that balance. Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I move that Bill 133, the Intercity Bus Service Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and say a few words on Bill number 133. Mr. Speaker, our caucus is in support of this bill. Mr. Speaker, this bill was introduced as a result of Acadian Lines closing down their operation in our province. As we're all aware, this coming Friday, Acadian Lines will be closing their operation. Mr. Speaker, the bus industry in our province has struggled naturally for many years with economic challenges. Prior to this legislation, Mr. Speaker, companies had to apply to the Utility and Review Board and attend public hearings. And naturally, to attend public hearings, they had to hire lawyers to assist. with applications including requests for changing tariffs and schedules and routes. Mr. Speaker, this process was certainly time-consuming and very costly to these companies. Under the piece of legislation that's before the House, Mr. Speaker, these responsibilities that the URB once had will now be shifted over to the Minister of Transportation to allow, naturally, bus companies to make timely, reasonable changes to schedules and routes and tariffs without the cost of hiring lawyers and attending these public hearings. Mr. Speaker, we all recognize that bus companies need some flexibility to respond to market changes and demands with the general public. Also, Mr. Speaker, understand the industry has lobbied government for these changes, and that the Utility Review Board is also on side with these changes that are proposed in this bill. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal caucus is in support of this bill to move through third and final reading.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of the PC caucus, we're glad to see that these changes are coming forth to the inner-city bus routes to make it easier for students and people in the province who need bus service in the rural areas especially, so that it will enable them to travel throughout the province in a fairly reasonable manner and allow the bus companies to maintain that service here in the province. So with that, I'll take my seat.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to acknowledge the members on the other side saying that it's possible that we can change their minds from time to time. Doesn't seem possible most of the time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a delight to be able to stand up here for a few minutes and say a few words about the Intercity Bus Services Act. As you know, Mr. Speaker, my constituency includes many students. I have 6 universities within the confines of my constituency. I've got a number of seniors buildings. We've got a number of people traveling in and out of the city of Halifax, a lot of university students, many people coming to the city to get essential treatment and services. So it's important, Mr. Speaker, to the members of my constituency that we have a reliable and safe transit system. I know, Mr. Speaker, we were out on a caucus outreach not that long ago, and we talked to a number of people who and I must say, it didn't really occur to me that there were so many vulnerable people who relied so much on the bus services. There were people who needed to bus their way into the nearest urban centre to get essential treatment. One of the people I spoke with had cancer and was traveling with her spouse to go to and from, and when the bus service collapsed, they had no way of going in, and they were taking a taxi in, which imposes another huge burden, and they had to stay overnight, and it's just extraordinary the amount of hardship it imposed on people, Mr. Speaker. We had students who are trying to get to go back to their homes, many students who come into the city and go back to their rural communities. We had a number of people who needed to go to and from to work, and they were using the intercity bus services as a way of commuting. And so, Mr. Speaker, this the collapse really reminded us of how important intercity bus service is to so many communities, and so many people are vulnerable to the loss of service. So I must commend the Minister for bringing forward this legislation and for creating the conditions for making sure that as many Nova Scotians, as many people who need this service get it in the most efficient and most cost-effective way. And so this legislation, Mr. Speaker, it builds on the flexibility that the Utility and Review Board introduced when it ruled on an application for Maritime Bus to take over from Acadian Lines. It streamlines the regulations, which was one of the complaints, that it was too cumbersome to make changes and to respond to the market and to respond to possible cost savings. So this makes it easier, Mr. Speaker, for bus operators to succeed in the province while protecting the interests and safety of the travelling public. So bus operators now, Mr. Speaker, under this legislation will be able to make timely and reasonable changes to the tariffs, the schedules, the routes, without incurring the cost of going through a very heavy and cumbersome and difficult regulatory process of hiring a professional or hiring a lawyer to represent them at a URB ruling. And this will allow us and allow the operators a much more timely response to requests for routine changes. Where there are significant changes, there will still be the opportunity for public input. And where the minister feels a more thorough review is warranted, the application might be referred to the Utility and Review Board for a fuller assessment. In other words, Mr. Speaker, this legislation strikes a fine balance between making creating an efficient, reducing red tape, making a much more streamlined system that's able to respond to changes in circumstances, to changes in public preferences, while at the same time making sure that larger issues relating to health and safety are dealt with in a much more rigorous and much more careful way. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say again that we have a number of people in our community who've come forward and say, you know, you've got to do something about the intercity bus service. You've got to make it possible for people to make their way to health appointments. You have to make it possible for people to go to their jobs. You've got to make it possible for students to go back and forth to their homes. For people who do not drive, Mr. Speaker, for people who are environmentally conscious and feel that that using public transit is a way of reducing their carbon footprints. There are a number of advantages to this, Mr. Speaker, and certainly we want to anchor the intercity bus service in a very stable and reliable and safe way. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I want to again thank the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal for bringing this forward. I want to thank the many people who came to us and said that something needs to be done to protect those vulnerable people. And we believe that this bill takes us in that direction. It puts public transit in a much safer, much more reliable footing, and we hopefully will lay the foundation for a much broader system that's more accessible to more Nova Scotians. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, our constituencies are demanding better public transit, and this puts us on that road. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal. It'll be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to as well thank my colleagues across the House and the colleague on this side of the House who have risen to speak in support of this bill. I would now again move the third reading and request that this bill do pass.
The question is for third reading of Bill number 133, the Intercity Bus Services Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour? Those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 133, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 292 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Carrier Act, respecting intercity bus service.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I will now recognize the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please call address and reply.
Address and reply. The Honourable Member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I rose a few minutes ago to speak briefly on Bill 131, and I got such a favorable reception from my fans on this side of the from my fans on this side of the House and my fans over there that I felt inspired to speak again. And so I heard somebody say, "What's not to love?" And I'll have to let my fans deal with that. But it is as always a great pleasure to rise and speak a bit about the place from which I hail and the people I represent in the House of Assembly. And Mr. Speaker, I of course am referring to the beautiful constituency of Lunenburg West on Nova Scotia's equally beautiful South Shore. Mr. Speaker, I think many of you know this in the House. Not all people may know that Lunenburg West is that part of Lunenburg County, from the Lehave River west to the Queens County line, north to the Queens and Annapolis County lines, and south to the Atlantic Ocean. And again, I suppose many people know that the major town in the area is Bridgewater. It's about 7,500 residents, but there are many small and beautiful villages scattered throughout that region as well. With my colleague here says name 2. I can name about 40, but they're beautiful villages with beautiful names. Names like Pleasantville and New Elm and West Dublin and Dublin Shore, and I could go on, but I did that once before, and I was accused by the member from Timberley Prospect as doing the Hank Snow tune there. I've been everywhere, so I won't go through them all. But they are gorgeous communities with equally lovely people in them. Mr. Speaker, the community of Lehave is the oldest settlement in Canada, and for a long time it was the capital of New France. Some people don't know that. Our area was settled by waves of immigrants from Europe, Germans, French, British, Irish, and their influence, of course, is reflected in the names of our communities and by our surnames. A cursory glance, for instance, at the South Shore phone book in the New Germany, Lehave, or Chelsea or Bridgewater exchanges will attest, of course, to the veracity of that statement. And I can hear people naming off surnames of my constituents while I'm standing here. But that's why, we were an area that was settled by immigration, and that's why I'm so pleased that after years of inactivity on the immigration file by many previous governments, the Premier of our province has seen fit to negotiate higher immigration limits for our province, because we need more of them and we want them to come here. Mr. Speaker, we know we have an aging and in some rural areas a declining population, and as a result, given the significant work done in creating new job opportunities for our citizens, we will need every available worker in order to fill these vacancies. Opportunities created by our government related to the shipbuilding project, the Muskrat Falls project, the Nova Centre project, and the offshore oil exploration projects recently announced by both Shell and BP will require many person-hours of work to bring them to fruition. And as I said before, we'll need lots of folks to help us do that. Perhaps even more significantly, we are starting to see businesses that wish to come to Nova Scotia to set up shop in our region. In the past few months, I guess this was reported probably both by the television media and also in the news, Air Canada Jazz has announced a move from London, Ontario to Halifax. Baskin & Robbins has announced the move from Peterborough, Ontario to Truro. Projects has moved from Calgary to Halifax, and more recently, IBM has decided to locate an analytics center in our capital city here. The last two alone that I've mentioned involving about 900 jobs. Now, Mr. Speaker, after 20 years of stagnation, I hear the member from Richmond over there chirping away at me, but after 20 years of stagnation, after 20 years of stagnation and flat growth, they know I love them anyway, but anyway, after 20 years of stagnation and flat growth in this province, we finally started to kickstart the economy. Finally we started to kickstart it. After years of failed attempts to grow the economy by both parties on the other side, we're finally on the move in the right direction. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, I know this is a hard pill for those in opposition to swallow, and so daily in this House we listen to, you know, bleating and blustering and whining and that sort of thing by that group who can't seem to stand the prospect of prosperity, prosperity that wasn't created by them, because you see, Mr. Speaker, that would point to the failure that I just referenced a few minutes ago. So since they failed for lo these many years in job creation and growing the economy, they have what can only be described, I think, and I will describe it this way, as sort of an anti-business, anti-growth attitude, which is manifested in the most bizarre ways. And Mr. Speaker, if you don't mind, permit me to give you sort of a nasty example of that of which I speak. Earlier this month, in this House, the CEO of Projects, a business, as you well know, bringing about 440 good jobs to our province, was present in the gallery. It was in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. The CEO was present there when the Premier welcomed Projects to Nova Scotia from his place in the chamber here. Now, Mr. Speaker, both opposition leaders, the leader of the Liberal Party and the leader of the Third Party, were what I would describe as overtly rude and disrespectful to this businessman. Now, some of my colleagues who have been in this House much longer than I, expressed shock and dismay with regard to this behavior. And I have to say that my constituents do not want visitors, particularly ones bringing good jobs, who come to our province, to be treated in such a way. And as a matter of fact, I heard about that when I went home. Rather, in the spirit of what Nova Scotians are all about, folks in my area expect us to welcome visitors with open arms. Now, Mr. Speaker, constituents of mine want jobs, not just for themselves, because we're not selfish in Lunenburg West, not at all, not just for themselves, but for all Nova Scotians. They want prosperity. And the opposition parties should, if nothing else, get out of the way and let this happen. Now, if they can't be part of the solution,
Order. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm sure the member for Lunenburg West would not want to be misleading Nova Scotians in the speech that he's giving and his statements about the comments made by both the Leader of the Official Opposition and the Leader of the Conservative Party regarding projects, but he may want to read allnovascotia.com today and to see the letter that was submitted by Harborside Engineering Consultants, a Nova Scotia company.
Order. There was no point of order. There was not. You just started in your remarks. So I would now recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Well, I think. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for allowing me to proceed after that interlude there. So I think what I was saying before I was interrupted there, my point was if they can't be part of the solution, at the very least they should not be part of the problem. That's my point. So it's ironic that, you know, and I'll speak to that point. It's ironic that they couldn't create jobs when they were governing, and now in opposition, they want to continue to foster that culture of defeat, or whatever you call it. I think culture of defeat, and make sure our government is fettered as we strive to develop and grow the economy of the province. Now, Mr. Speaker, they can try all they want, but the past has shown us they will fail. and we will get on with it. Our NDP government will drag them, the Liberals and the Conservatives for that matter, kicking and screaming into a brighter future, and we will leave it to them, leave it to the member for Argyle who's chirping away at me over there. We'll leave it to them to explain why they want to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and why they do not want to be part of growth and progress. That's what they'll have to explain at some point. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have sat and listened. I have sat and listened here, because I do that a lot, for hours and hours in this place to criticism by the opposition parties on a number of issues, and I would be the first to agree. I would be the first to agree that that is their job. Their job is to criticize. However, I have to say that the quality of the criticism often leaves much to be desired. And Mr. Speaker, allow me to elaborate. Madam Speaker, pardon me, allow me to elaborate. Just a little bit. For literally months on end, our government was criticized, and I think just recently there by the member for, I think it was Kings West, the other day in a resolution. We have been criticized over and over again for the cancellation of the Yarmouth Ferry. Now, I absolutely recognize that this is an important issue for all residents in my region of the province. And I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, that I have a great deal, Madam Speaker, that I have a great deal of respect for all those folks living in Queens, Shelburne, and Yarmouth counties. And I would also say that I spend a considerable amount of my time in the summer visiting the communities in that picturesque part of the province. The member for Argyle and the member for Yarmouth and the member for Shelburne, I am in that area a lot in the summertime because it is beautiful there. Now, the implication conveyed by the opposition in this House, and particularly I would say by the member for Argyle and the member for Yarmouth, is that the cancellation of the CAT, which is what the boat was called, and I think everybody knows that, was some kind of a unilateral decision by the province with little care or caution, and that somehow it was a decision that I guess we pulled out of the hat or something without due diligence. Now, Madam Speaker, that the implication is that, and they're still saying exactly what I'm pointing out. So I hope the chatter can be heard on this side of the House. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, the implication is that this was a totally made in Nova Scotia decision, and I want to clarify that, and I want to clarify it for the record. First of all, Atlantic Canadian ferries between major ports are part of the national transportation system, and more specifically, the ferries on major routes in Atlantic Canada are jointly funded, and everybody on that side of the House knows it. Newfoundland ferries are cost shared by the Nova Scotia government, the Newfoundland government, and the federal government. The Prince Edward Island ferries are cost shared by the Prince Edward Island government.
Order. It's becoming increasingly difficult to hear the member. The honourable member for Lunenburg West has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I don't know, I must be poking the ant's nest there or something. I don't know. Somebody's making these guys. Did we have the B Act in here today? Because it's all a buzz over there. Anyway, and that's such a bad pun. Anyway, Madam Speaker, as I was saying, I'm back to Prince Edward Island, where my colleague from Timberley Prospect has a cottage and talks about it all the time. Prince Edward Island ferries are cost shared by the PEI, Nova Scotia, and federal governments. The Digby Ferry, which we often hear about, is funded by the Nova Scotia government, the New Brunswick government, and the federal government. So, having sort of reviewed that, the salient feature of these arrangements, in case anybody missed it, is that they're cost shared by three partners. Three. So, Madam Speaker, the federal Liberal government, and this is not a criticism of the provincial Liberal government, I am saying the federal Liberal government cut the subsidy to the CAT, to that vessel, in the mid-1990s. And it was actually under the Honourable Paul Martin. And hence we lost, for anybody who, it was a previous ferry, okay, but hence we lost our federal partner, and Nova Scotia was left to go it alone. Now, when we approached the governor of Maine for help, because that would be logical to do that, because let me see, the boat went from Yarmouth to Maine. Okay, so when we approached the governor of Maine for help, he asked us to present the business case, after which, Madam Speaker, he respectfully declined support. So, Madam Speaker, you'll recollect that I noted earlier that the other major ferries in the region have 3 funding partners. Now, it is important to realize that 3 more significant events happened which contributed to the ridership of this particular ferry declining by over 70% in a few years. Now, Madam Speaker, well, you know, I'm finding this amusing. I mean, I'm finding this, whatever that is going on over there, I find that amusing and kind of entertaining in a sick sort of way. Anyway, after 9/11, Americans, Madam Speaker, were required to buy passports to get readmitted to their own country if they traveled outside its borders. Now, many Americans considered this a form of tax and refused to purchase one. And this eliminated, of course, the possibility of travel to countries like Canada, because they need a passport to, because of Homeland Security, to get back into their own country. Another thing that happened, Madam Speaker, is that gas prices skyrocketed, discouraging summer travel around the same time. And finally, when the United States and Canadian currencies reached parity, this caused a further problem. So simply put, many American visitors chose to stay at home. And they usually do that, I might add, when they do not receive 20 cents back on every dollar that they spend here in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, what happened? Ridership on the CAT had been declining prior to 2009. We had no funding partners, none. I told you, 3, there were normally 3. We had no funding partners, meaning the entire financial burden fell totally on the province of Nova Scotia. This, as all members on both sides of this House really know, was unsustainable and untenable. Did the current federal government, the Conservatives, offer to reinstate the subsidy?
No. Harper was cutting everything.
No. Did the governor of Maine offer to fiscally support the service?
No.
Thank you. That, Madam Speaker, meant there was one and only one funder for a service that was, as I pointed out, in steady decline for a number of reasons, which I've also pointed out. The province of Nova Scotia was on the hook, and I submit to you that it was not sustainable. Now, knowing this, what would a responsible government do? Well, Madam Speaker, they would work with the community to try to find the right boat at the right price with the right schedule to make the service sustainable. And that is exactly what we did, Madam Speaker. And as of right now, we have $21 million on the table over 7 years, and we are actively trying to make that happen. The Liberals, and particularly the member for Yarmouth, if he'd like to comment, might want to examine why his federal cousins canceled the subsidy in the first place, and the member for Argyll may wish to contact his federal cousins and ask them where their contribution is toward reinstating this service. Because constantly we hear about how important it is, and we agree, so we'd like to know that. So the member from Citadel Sable Island is saying those cats never came back to the table, and they have not. And so what I would like to see is show me the money, not empty words. These members spent countless hours in this very chamber, as early as just the other day, reading resolutions on this issue. I had to sit here and listen to them. They berated the Premier. They berated the Premier. They berated the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism for hours on end, even though they know that every effort was being made and is being made to resolve this issue.
But they're doing nothing.
And I already indicated what they could do to be helpful. Now, simply put, Madam Speaker, they followed that same old partisan path they use when they oppose us on creating jobs and growing the economy. They long for the good old days, which saw the economy of this province stagnate for the last 20 years. When the real story is told, Madam Speaker, most folks understand why we couldn't go it alone. And now, Madam Speaker, I'd like to turn a little bit to the rural economy, because that's another area in here that much has been said about. And we know that historically, for sure, we have some challenges here. And we don't mind admitting that, of course. We have seen and are seeing declining populations, outmigration of young people, and perhaps most troubling of all, in a way, an aging demographic. And here's an area where the opposition parties could really get involved. In my area, we have had some serious blows to our economic base, and I think the members of this House, my colleagues on this side and on that side, are well aware. Most of what those are. Most folks know that when Resolute had serious issues related to the sustainability of the mill in Brooklyn and their other assets in the region, our government was there to support them. And the people in my area and in that area are most appreciative of that. So what did the opposition parties do to support a major employer in my area? Well, the Liberals, in typical Liberal fashion, were for it on the streets of Liverpool, against it in the House, then kind of for it, then kind of against it, and I think they're still kind of against it because you never really know where they stand on things like this. The PC party, to their credit, was much clearer. The PC party was extremely clear. Madam Speaker, they summed it up in a few words. I believe the leader of the third party asked us why we were buying dirt. I think that's what he said. My guess in my area of the province is, my guess is he'll get his answer about that in the next election. I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that statements like that are not appreciated by my constituents and the hard-working citizens of the South Shore affected by the closure of that mill. But in the old partisan tradition of that crew, I have to say it was expected. Now, Madam Speaker, one would think after turning their backs on the rural Nova Scotians in my area, they might have taken a bit of time for reflection. That's what makes you wise, time for reflection, and decided that a laissez-faire policy by government in relation to the support of rural jobs might not be the best policy. Well, Madam Speaker, as the member for Preston so often says in this House, guess what? Guess what? They did it again to the people of Port Hawkesbury. I couldn't believe it, but they did. On the South Shore, when something like this happens, we say we got gobsmacked. That's the term we used in it. We got gobsmacked. Well, Madam Speaker, I was gobsmacked, and so were the people in my constituency. There were apparently no lessons learned by any members of the Liberal or PC caucuses or their commanders-in-chief, I hesitate to use leaders there, involving the support of our rural citizenry. For example, the member for Richmond was silent. He said nothing in support of help for that mill, but as is often the case with the Liberals, he had lots of disparaging remarks to make in the House about it. Similarly, the member for Inverness had little to say by way of support either. Again, quick to criticize, but no positive substantive suggestions, although in fairness, I believe this is correct, and I'll stand corrected if it's not. I believe that the member for Inverness did say in the House recently that he liked seeing steam come out of the stack when he drove by. So I'll take that as a bit of a positive. It's probably enhancered. So I guess, Madam Speaker, we might take that as a bit of a positive comment. Now, Madam Speaker, I can tell you who did something for that rural area and those rural areas. We did. We did. We did. We made a choice, Madam Speaker, we made a choice to support the men and women in that part of our province by keeping that modern super calendar mill in operation so that the citizens and the businesses there could have a brighter future And if any of them are hearing me now, I want them to know that this Premier and this government has been with them and will be with them every step of the way. Madam Speaker, both opposition parties were silent when we were trying to help, vocally critical once the deal was done. Once the deal was done, very critical. Now, Madam Speaker, another serious and troubling trait that I see manifesting itself in those on the other side of this House is a distinct inability, or perhaps lack of desire, to see things from a global perspective or in a global context. For instance, let me give you an example, Madam Speaker. When it comes to the world economy, of which we are a part, I hope nobody's saying we're not part of the world economy. When it comes to the world economy, of which we are a part, there seems to be a lack of understanding by those on the other side that we have been for a few years, in the worst recession since the Great Depression. I mean, the Governor of the Bank of Canada will point that out. Everybody will point that out. Not defending the federal parties, but both of them agree on this. So that's the case. Now, Madam Speaker, even folks with a rudimentary understanding of economics acknowledge this. I think that the average citizen would assume that a member who sits in this House would, at the very least, have some knowledge of global economic and financial forces that are affecting our country and, of course, our province. Even if one is not an avid reader or cognizant of micro and macroeconomic concepts or a follower of the economic paradigms of Keynes or Friedman, one would assume that by watching television newscasts, there would be a basic recognition of the economic woes affecting Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, the UK, the United States, and I could go on, but I won't. There would be some kind of rudimentary understanding. Well, and somebody says, what about Canada? And what about Canada? Thanks to a Liberal Prime Minister, Mr. Chrétien, I think we're in pretty good shape. I remember when they wanted to open up it's true. Credit where credit is due. They wanted to open up the Canadian banking system to foreign banks, and he said no, and good on him that he did. And as a result, you know, what about Canada? Well, we're doing among, I think, the best of the G7, and I think we're doing among the best of all countries in the world. And as a result, we're able to be in a pretty good position in moving forward. Now, surely I would expect by watching, let's go back to TV. The thing that I don't watch very much, but some people do. Surely by now, most people would have heard, whether even they ever heard of it before, of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the subprime mortgage fiasco, the debacle affecting firms on Wall Street, and the most recent threat, the so-called financial cliff. Now, Madam Speaker, during the absolute best of economic times, the parties opposite, the old-style parties there, the Liberals and the Conservatives, failed to grow the Nova Scotian economy. As a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, we have been, under the leadership of those parties, at the very bottom of the economic pile in Canada for the last 20 years. Now, Madam Speaker, that approach has not worked, and they know it, and I believe they harbor, I don't know, from what I'm hearing over there, some kind of irrational hope that maybe we'll not be able to succeed where they failed. I hope that's not true. So simply put, they seem to be like contrarians and obstructionists or something, and their approach is simply to say no to everything proposed by our government. Well, Madam Speaker, that won't work either. The people are watching, and they're slowly figuring this out. So, Madam Speaker, in the absolute worst economic times since the Great Depression, acknowledged by many people, not our party necessarily, acknowledged by people, our government has created jobs, saved jobs, managed departments in a fiscally responsible manner, bringing them in under budget in most cases, and attracted new businesses to the province, like Air Canada Jazz from London, which I already cited, Baskin & Robbins from Peterborough, projects from Calgary, Wuxi from the UK. There's literally hundreds of examples of these things now and moving into the future. Now, Madam Speaker, one can only speculate. One can only speculate on the carnage that would have been perpetrated on the populace had either of those old-style parties been in charge of managing the economy of this province in the economic conditions which currently pertain in our province now. Madam Speaker, we have been able somehow to navigate these troubled waters through a combination of factors, including sound fiscal management by two able finance ministers, the generation of thoughtful and careful plans related to important issues affecting our province, like healthcare, roads, forestry, for example, and through strong and capable leadership by an experienced and capable premier. And this was brought home to me recently when I made contact with some businesses in my area and was told by, for instance, an RV dealer that his business was up 20% over last year, and by the owner of a car dealership that said he sold 10 more units this October than in the same month last year. So this view was expressed to me, and this has been the view that's been expressed to me by the business community in my area, that businesses grow because of strong management skills and the application of modern business principles. I was told that businesses which do not change or that use outdated technologies and outdated practices are doomed to fail. Well, Madam Speaker, this was good advice, and it applies to governments as well, which is why we have been successful creating jobs and growing the economy. And with that, I will stop there. I'm sure these people are getting tired of listening to me on the other side. And I will adjourn debate and with your permission, Madam Speaker, and continue on another day. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to have a few minutes today to maybe bring a few words in address and reply. Since the goal here, Madam Speaker.
1 second, please.
That's my privilege in this house.
Recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to bring some comments for a little while this afternoon. It's been interesting this session, you know, so far, Madam Speaker. We've called hours and more hours and different hours and extended hours, and today at 3 o'clock the business of the day was done. But yet, again today, as in previous days, Madam Speaker, here we are, continuing on. My light's still on. I guess that means I can continue.
Order.
Order.
Thank you. The honourable member, Deputy House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The debate had been adjourned and agreed to, and the member for Lunenburg West is the one that would continue. He adjourned debate. He adjourned debate. So that was very, very clear, Madam Speaker. Very clear. And he will be back another day, as he indicated.
I'm just going to take a moment and get some advice on this one. Thank you, with the clerk. Just give me a moment, please. Okay, I have clarification. Because the member moved to adjourn debate, the next step would have been to call for a question on that motion. So we will now proceed with that. There's been a motion to adjourn debate. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Nay. The motion is carried. Recognize the Honourable Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That concludes the government business for today. And I would defer to the leader of the, or the, actually, the House Leader of the opposition party for Opposition Day, but the House hours will be from 2 until 6 tomorrow.
Recognize the House Leader for the official opposition.
Madam Speaker, on a point of order, first, I should point out that, as you know, the hours today were set from 12 to 6 p.m. It's currently 3:52 p.m. Madam Speaker, we have numerous opposition bills that we'd be more than happy to debate this evening. In fact, I believe there's even some members who'd like to speak on address and reply to speech from the throne. And once again, we're at a loss as to why this government continues to call hours and then everyone goes home early because the government doesn't wish to continue to do business. So anyways, Madam Speaker, we'll let Nova Scotians judge, but we're more than happy to stay here till 6 o'clock and do the business of the people of Nova Scotia. Apparently, the government is not interested in doing so. Madam Speaker, now that that point of order is finished, did you want to rule on that point of order first? Go ahead.
That one. That would not be a point of order. Recognize the House Leader for the official opposition.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, for taking the time to rule on that point of order. I do want to advise that tomorrow is the official opposition business day. The hours are 2 to 6, as pointed out by the Deputy House Leader for the government. After daily routine and question period, we will be calling resolution number 2275, which deals with the Yarmouth Ferry and neglect of the economy in rural Nova Scotia by the government. And the second bill we'll be calling is Bill 103, Accountability in Economic Development Assistance Act. And with that, Madam Speaker, I'd move that the House now rise and we meet again tomorrow till the hours of 2 to 6 p.m.
Thank you. The motion is that we do now rise to meet again tomorrow, Wednesday, November the 28th, between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Nay. The motion is carried. I now call under Rule 5.5, resolution for late debate as submitted by the MLA for Hants West that reads, therefore be it resolved that all members of the Legislative Assembly acknowledge that we have the... Order, please. So I can finish the... Order. Resolution under 5.5 that reads, therefore be it resolved that all members of the Legislative Assembly acknowledge that we have the highest power prices in Canada and a commission is not needed to know that the power rates are hurting Nova Scotians and damaging our economy. I now recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I guess I'll get a few minutes to talk today anyway on something very important to Nova Scotians, more so than wasting our time in this legislature talking about absolutely nothing. I never heard so much verbal sewage flowing on my life as I have from that member over there.
Order, please. I would ask the member to retract as those are unparliamentary.
Unparliamentary?
Yes, sir, Bob.
I guess, unfortunately, Madam Speaker, I'll have to, although those are the words that were meant, I will have to retract it based on your wish, and so done.
Thank you. The honourable
Madam Speaker, you know, we stand in this place, we have an opportunity to talk about important things. And what do we talk about? Non-important things, and waste the afternoon away here. So, you know what, Madam Speaker, let's talk about where we really are in this province, Madam Speaker. We really are on the bottom. That's where we're at. Except a few points, highest taxes, highest power rates in the country, and there are reports that will show, you know, Madam Speaker, that have already been filed been filed that we are indeed paying the highest taxes and the highest power rates in this province. And what are they doing? For the party that said we are the better deal for today's families, they're far from that. Look where things have gone. And they've got the audacity to stand up in their place and criticize parties that have been in power in the past who have, they make it sound like, you know what, Madam Speaker, they make it sound like every government that's ever been has purposely wanted to put the wood to Nova Scotians. You know that? And do nothing for them. But I can tell you there was a lot of good done in the 10 years of previous government, Madam Speaker. But they would never want to admit that. They're too busy, well, I can't say those words either, trying to justify their existence. Well put, probably better than what I would have said, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker. But you know what? The reality is that the power rates in this province are too high, and we're doing nothing to resolve them. Talking about plans that will never come to fruition. We see the deal with Newfoundland, and that deal is by far nowhere close to being secured. We're a long ways, Madam Speaker, from securing power rates or any kind of a deal from Newfoundland. And they're saying, it's interesting to say that they want to do the long-term stable power rates, but they've got no prices on it. They want to provide fair power rates, but they're not looking at options. They're not looking at options, Madam Speaker. What are they doing? Focused on one deal they don't even know what's going to cost. We continue to see capital projects rise. We're going to continue to see more of that. The history shows that. It's there. We're already paying 15 cents plus per kilowatt hour in the province of Nova Scotia. We're going to see another potential 6% get resolved in the coming weeks now as the year comes to an end. There'll soon need to be a decision made. And what are we doing about it? Standing in this House, wasting time talking about blaming other parties from years gone by instead of focused on what the real needs of Nova Scotians are. Talking about jobs, creating jobs. What are they doing? Creating nothing. I mentioned a few minutes ago what exactly he created for the last half hour, 40 minutes, what flowed. Madam Speaker, you know what? There's a lot of good that can be done in power, and instead of focusing on all members and bringing forward good ideas and bits and pieces maybe of legislation that the opposition does put forward, because I believe, Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, although we are in opposition, we do want to do the right thing for Nova Scotians. We do want to put forward good things on behalf of the constituents that we represent, unlike what that member just described. He would have you believe that we are here to do nothing more than be critical of government decisions. We're critical when we need to be critical, Madam Speaker, and we support multiple things that have gone through this House this session so far already without being critical. But that doesn't matter. You know, that doesn't matter. This is about something else altogether. Really, Madam Speaker, this is about something else altogether. We should be thinking about some of the ideas that have been put forward to reduce power rates, if that's possible, or to at least stabilize them with fair prices. Is that possible? We believe that it is. We believe we should be freezing power rates right now. That's the right thing to do, and let's analyze if we're going to take some time to look at what alternatives might exist. There are some opportunities to look at other ideas, but unless you're on that side of the House, the ideas don't matter. That's really what it boils down to, Madam Speaker. No one on this side of the House, in their opinion, or at least in the member for Lunenburg West's opinion, has anything of value to put forward, and I stand here in my place to say that that is absolutely incorrect. It is not that we are not working hard for our constituents, because I can tell you, every day that I meet with constituents who are struggling with power bills. Everywhere you go, you hear about power bills, you hear about the highest taxes, you hear about no jobs. I need only drive down to Hansport. We could introduce the honourable member from Lunenburg West to the residents of Hansport and to members from Minas Basin. He could tell them all about how good he is and how wonderful things are in the NDP government, all the great things he's done. What's been done there? Job losses. For the second time around, 150 jobs went a couple of years ago under this watch, if they're so wonderful in their watch. 150 jobs went, nothing, not a word. No support, nothing offered, no meetings. But I'll give credit where it's due, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker. The Minister of Economic Development and Tourism, he did come down to Hansport